The day Edna Sullivan's last hen stopped laying eggs was the same day she realized she might not survive the winter. She stood in the gray morning light of October 1882, the Oklahoma Territory stretching out around her in all its indifferent beauty, red dust, rising off the flat earth like smoke from a fire that had long since gone cold. The hen house smelled of straw and emptiness. She held the single egg she had found that morning in both hands, turning it slowly, as though it might crack open and reveal some answer to the question that had been haunting her for 3 days straight, which was how a woman of 26 with 160 acres of land, a broken plow, a leaking roof, and 43 cents to her name was supposed to keep on living. She had not eaten a full meal in 3 days. Not since the cornbread and salt pork she had scraped together on Sunday, which she had divided carefully into 2 portions and eaten one at a time, making herself wait 12 hours between each half so her stomach would not catch on to what was happening. She was not a woman who complained easily. She had crossed 3 states on her own after her husband, Roy Sullivan, had been thrown from a horse and died out on the trail 8 months ago, leaving her with nothing but the deed to the land he had filed on under the Homestead Act and a small trunk of belongings that barely filled the back of the wagon. She had built the fence herself, post by post, using a mallet that raised blisters on her palms that hardened eventually into calluses. She had planted a garden. She had tried to keep the plow in good working order. She had done everything a person could reasonably be expected to do. But the drought that summer had been cruel, and the creek that ran along the eastern edge of her property had dropped to little more than a muddy trickle by August, and the corn had come in thin and pale, and the potatoes had gone soft in the ground before she could get them up, and now it was October and the cold was settling in with a purpose, and Edna Sullivan was standing in an empty hen house holding a single egg and trying very hard not to cry. She had been a schoolteacher back in Missouri. She had known how to conjugate Latin verbs and recite the complete works of Tennyson. None of that felt particularly useful right now. She walked back to the house, which was a small soddy set into the earth at the edge of the property, the walls thick and dark, the single window letting in just enough light to read by during the brightest part of the afternoon. She set the egg on the table and sat down across from it and stared at it for a long time. She could boil it and eat it. It would take the edge off for maybe an hour. She could save it and hope one of the other hens started laying again, though they had not shown any inclination toward productivity in weeks. She could walk the 4 miles into Claxton and spend her 43 cents on something more substantial, but the walk would cost her more energy than she had. And besides, 43 cents in a general store in 1882 did not go very far. The town of Claxton, Oklahoma Territory, was not a large place. It had a main street with a general store, a livery stable, a post office that doubled as the telegraph office, a saloon, and a church that had only recently gotten a proper roof. The nearest large settlement was Guthrie, a full day's ride to the north. The people of Claxton were not unkind exactly, but they were busy with their own survival, and a widow woman trying to prove up on a homestead claim was not the sort of thing that captured much sympathetic attention when everyone around her was fighting the same drought, the same thin harvests, the same brutal land. She did not know Timothy Ralston yet. She had seen him once from a distance, about 2 weeks before. He had ridden past on a big roan mare, heading south along the road that ran by the edge of her property, and she had been out patching the fence at the time, and she had looked up long enough to register that he was tall in the saddle and that his hat was the deep brown of old leather. He had not looked her way, or if he had, she had not noticed. She had gone back to her fence. She had heard his name in town. Timothy Ralston had taken over the Hargrove spread about 3 miles to the west, the one that old Ben Hargrove had tried to work for 15 years before his lungs gave out on him. Hargrove had built it up into something respectable, 40 head of cattle and a proper barn, and when he died the previous spring, his widow had sold the whole operation and moved back east to her sister in Cincinnati. Timothy Ralston had bought it at what people said was a fair price, which in Claxton meant he had not cheated anyone. He was from Texas, the eastern part, the kind of man who had grown up working cattle and knew the land the way some people know a language they were born into. He was 29 years old and unmarried, and the women of Claxton had noted this with varying degrees of interest and scheming. Edna had not noted it at all, because she had been too busy trying to survive. She picked up the egg from the table and put it in the small pot of water she kept on the stove, which burned low and steady on the 2 pieces of wood she allowed herself each morning. She boiled it 6 minutes, peeled it over the table so she would not lose any of it, and ate it standing up, which she did not usually allow herself because her mother had always said that a woman who could not be bothered to sit down for a meal had lost some essential piece of her dignity. But the stove was warm and the chair was cold, and she was tired in a way that went down into her bones. So she stood and she ate, and she looked out the single window at the gray October sky and tried to think of what to do next. The next morning she woke before dawn to the sound of wind. She lay on the rope bed with the 2 quilts pulled up to her chin and listened to it move around the corners of the soddy, low and searching. Her stomach made a sound that was almost embarrassing. She pressed her hand flat against it as though she could quiet it by force. She had a flour sack in the kitchen that had maybe half a cup of flour left in the very bottom of it. She had a small tin of baking powder, a pinch of salt, and some lard that had gone slightly off but was still technically usable. She had no milk, no eggs after yesterday's boiled one, no molasses, no sugar. She had water from the barrel outside, which was getting low. She made herself get up and build the fire and mix what she had into something that looked approximately like biscuits and smelled approximately like biscuits when they came out of the cast iron pan, though the taste was closer to a kind of pale, determined sadness. She ate half of what she made and wrapped the rest in cloth and put it in the corner of the kitchen where the temperature stayed coolest. She told herself she would eat the rest at supper. She told herself a lot of things in those days that required a certain amount of willful self-deception. By noon, she was outside working on the fence again, because the fence was something she could actually do something about. 2 of the posts on the north side had worked loose in the last windstorm, and she needed them solid before winter, or she would lose track of where her property ended and the open territory began, which mattered legally if she was going to prove up her claim. She was down on one knee, packing dirt around the base of a post with both hands, her fingers going numb in the cold, when she heard hoofbeats on the road. Looked up. The man on the roan mare pulled up at the edge of the road and looked at her for a moment before touching the brim of his hat. He was wearing a canvas coat the color of winter grass, and his face was angular and weathered in the way that outdoor work made a face, not old but experienced, the kind of face that had squinted into a lot of sun and a lot of wind and had arrived at a kind of settled steadiness because of it. "Ma'am," he said. "Sir," she said, because there was nothing else to say. He looked at the fence posts and then looked at her hands and then looked at the posts again. "Post drivers over there by your barn. Easier than packing by hand in cold ground." She looked toward the barn. There was indeed a fence post driver leaning against the wall, a heavy iron tool she had not been sure how to use properly. Roy had known about such things. She had been doing it by hand because she had been afraid of doing it wrong with the tool and splitting the post. "I know," she said, which was not entirely true. He did not seem to be a man who pressed his advantages in conversation. He looked out at the land for a moment, adjusted something on the saddle, then looked back at her. "Timothy Ralston," he said. "I'm out at the old Hargrove place." "I know," she said again. "Edna Sullivan." He nodded as though this confirmed something he had already heard. "You're the one proving up on the homestead claim." "That's right. How's it going?" There was something so plainly honest about the question, not cruel or pitying, just genuinely asking, that she almost told him the truth. She stopped herself in time. "It's going," she said. He looked at her for another moment, long enough that it was not quite comfortable but not quite uncomfortable either, and then he touched his hat brim again and clicked his mare forward and rode on south. Edna watched the red dust rise behind him and then went back to her fence post. That evening she ate the second half of her biscuits, which had gone stiff in the cloth. She chewed them slowly and drank 2 cups of water and went to bed with the wind still moving around the walls of the soddy, and she lay in the dark and thought about Timothy Ralston's question. How's it going? She could have told him. She could have said, it is going badly. I have not eaten properly in 3 days. I have 43 cents and half a cup of flour, and I do not know what I am going to do. She could have said that. She did not know why she had not. Pride, probably. The same pride that had kept her moving west after Roy died, when every sensible voice in her head had said to turn around and go back to Missouri, to her sister Clara's house, to the small and manageable life that had been waiting for her there. She had not been able to make herself turn around. Roy had believed in this land. He had read the pamphlets and studied the maps and talked about the territory with a light in his eyes that she had loved even when she had not entirely shared it. Coming here had felt like finishing something he had started, like honoring the direction he had pointed their lives in, even after he was no longer here to walk that direction himself. On the 3rd morning she woke to find the wind had stopped. The silence was so complete it woke her more thoroughly than any sound could have. She lay still for a moment and then got up and looked out the window. The sky was a pale, thin blue, the kind that came before hard cold, and the ground was laced with frost that caught the early light and threw it back up in small, cold sparks. It was beautiful the way the territory so often was, beautiful and indifferent and enormous. She had nothing to eat for breakfast. Not one thing in the kitchen that could constitute a meal. The flour was gone. The lard was gone. She had some dried beans in a jar but no energy to boil them properly and no appetite for plain boiled beans with nothing else, though she was aware that in an hour or 2 she would have appetite enough for anything. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the jar of beans and the empty flour sack and the cold stove and felt something she had not let herself feel since Roy died, which was a clean, clear despair. Not the dramatic kind. The quiet kind. The kind that sits down beside you without being asked and simply stays. She got dressed anyway. She put on her heaviest skirt and her wool coat and her boots, which had a crack along the left sole that let the cold through, and she went outside to do the morning chores, because the chickens still needed to be fed regardless of whether she had anything to eat herself, and the water barrel needed to be checked, and the fence still needed work, and none of that stopped being true just because she was hungry. She was out by the fence, the north side again, working a 3rd loose post back into true, when she saw the mare come around the bend in the road. She did not look up this time. She kept her hands on the post and worked the dirt around the base and listened to the hoofbeats slow and stop. She heard him dismount. She heard boots on frozen ground. She still did not look up. Mrs. Sullivan. She straightened then, because ignoring a direct address was not something she was capable of. He was standing at the fence, about 15 feet away, and he was holding something in his hands. A tin plate, covered with a cloth. The steam rising from beneath the cloth was visible in the cold air, small and persistent. He set it on the fence rail without ceremony, the way a man might set down a tool he was done with. "Cooked too much this morning," he said, and his voice was perfectly neutral, not apologetic, not making anything of it. "Figured you might as well have it." Then he turned and walked back to his mare, mounted her in one smooth motion and rode on down the road without looking back. Edna stood very still for a moment. Then she walked to the fence and lifted the cloth from the plate. There were scrambled eggs, 4 of them, cooked through and flecked with black pepper. There were 3 strips of bacon, properly crisped. There were 2 biscuits, real ones, golden brown, and a small crock of butter beside them, and tucked under the biscuits was a fold of cloth that contained 4 dried apricots, wrinkled and sweet-smelling even in the cold air. She sat down on the frozen ground right there beside the fence post she had been working on, and she ate every single thing on that plate. She ate slowly, deliberately, the way a person eats when they know that eating too fast after days of nothing will make them sick. She ate the eggs first, then the bacon, then one biscuit with butter, then the apricots one at a time, saving the second biscuit for last, breaking it into pieces and eating each piece separately so it would last longer. The cold did not bother her. The frozen ground beneath her did not bother her. The wind that came up around noon and blew her hair across her face did not bother her. When the plate was empty, she sat with it in her lap and looked out across her land, at the frost-edged grass and the pale sky, and the distant line of the road that ran west toward the Hargrove spread. And she felt something unlock in her chest that she had not known was locked. Not gratitude exactly, though there was gratitude in it. Something more fundamental, the simple animal relief of a body that has been fed. She cried a little quickly, the way she did everything these days, as though she did not want to spend too much time on any one emotion. Then she wiped her face on her sleeve and got up and carried the plate and the small crock inside and washed them carefully at the water basin. She would return them. That was clear. A person returned what was borrowed, even when it had been given without being asked for. The next morning she walked the 3 miles west to the Hargrove spread with the clean plate under her arm. She had debated waiting until she felt better, or until her hair looked less like something a bird might nest in, or until she had worked out what exactly she was going to say. But she was not a woman who delayed things without good reason, and delay for the sake of pride was not a good reason. So she wrapped herself in her wool coat and tied her hair back as neatly as she could manage and started walking. The Hargrove spread was more impressive up close than she had imagined. Old Ben Hargrove had built well and Timothy Ralston had clearly kept it up with equal care. The barn was solid, with a new patch on the roof that had been laid with skill. There were cattle in the far pasture, a neat, well-maintained herd, and she could see from the state of the fencing that Ralston understood the value of good fence the way she was learning it from necessity. There was a kitchen garden off the south side of the house that had been put to bed for winter properly, the beds covered with straw, the paths between them cleared. She knocked on the front door. He opened it after a moment, and she could tell from his expression that he had not expected her. He recovered quickly, the surprise moving off his face like a cloud across the sun. He was in his shirt sleeves, without the canvas coat, and he was taller indoors than she had registered outdoors. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said. "Mr. Ralston." She held out the plate and the crock. "Thank you, that was very kind." He took them. "How are you getting on?" he asked, and it was exactly the same question he had asked her at the fence, with exactly the same quality of genuine curiosity behind it. This time, for reasons she could not entirely account for, she told him the truth. Not all of it at once, but enough. She said the harvest had been thin. She said the hens were not laying well. She said she had 43 cents, and she was not sure how the next few weeks were going to go, and she was trying to work out what to do. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated more than she expected to. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the plate in his hands. Then he said, "Come inside, there's coffee." She hesitated. "It's coffee," he said with a dryness that was not unkind. "Not a proposal," she laughed, which surprised her so much that she put a hand over her mouth. The sound of her own laugh in the cold morning air felt like something from a different life. She went inside. The inside of the house was spare, but not cheerless. There was a rough-built table with 4 chairs, a cast-iron stove that was putting out a real and serious heat, a shelf with a row of books that she noticed immediately because she always noticed books, a braided rug in faded blues and greens on the wooden floor. The windows had proper curtains, which was unusual for a single man's house, and she learned later that they had been left by Ben Hargrove's wife, and Ralston had simply never removed them because they seemed to serve a purpose. He poured coffee into a tin mug and set it on the table and sat down across from her, without any of the performance that men sometimes put on for women, the elaborate courtesy that was really a way of reminding a woman that you were doing her a favor. He just sat down and wrapped his hands around his own mug and looked at her with those steady gray eyes and said, "Tell me about the plow." She had mentioned the plow in passing, the fact that it had broken 2 months ago, and she had not had the money to get it repaired. "The moldboard cracked," she said. "I got it to the blacksmith in Claxton, but he said it needed a new casting and he didn't have the right iron for it, and I couldn't afford to have it shipped from Guthrie anyway." "What kind of plow?" "Walking plow, single bottom. Roy bought it in Kansas on the way out." He nodded slowly. "I have a mold board that might fit. Came with some equipment from the Hargrove estate. I can look at it." She looked at him carefully. "Why?" He looked back at her with equal care. "Because a woman trying to prove up a homestead claim on her own, with a broken plow and a drought year behind her, has enough working against her without a neighbor who can't be bothered to help." It was such a plain, logical answer that she could not argue with it, and she did not try to. She drank her coffee, and he drank his, and they talked about practical things, the kind of conversation she had missed more than she had realized, the kind that was about soil and weather and equipment, and the real and specific challenges of working this particular piece of land at this particular time. He knew things about the territory that she did not know. She knew things about crop rotation and seed saving that he seemed genuinely interested in learning. The conversation went on for an hour and a half, and when she stood to go she felt, for the first time in 8 months, like a person with some purchase on the future. He walked her out to the yard. The roan mare was in the paddock nearby, watching them with the superior expression that certain horses put on when they have decided you are entertaining. "Her name's Pearl," he said, following her gaze. "Don't let her manner fool you. She's cooperative when she's got a reason to be." "That sounds like a description of half the people I know," Edna said. He smiled, and it changed his face completely. She had not seen it before, the smile, and it was not a small thing when it happened. It came from somewhere genuine, reaching his eyes and staying there for a moment before he let it settle back into the more neutral expression he wore by default. "I'll come by with that moldboard piece tomorrow," he said. "If it doesn't fit, we'll figure out something else." She walked home, and the 3 miles felt shorter going back than coming out. He came the next morning as promised, with the moldboard piece in his saddlebag and a set of tools tied to the back of the saddle. He looked at her broken plow in the barn and crouched down beside it with the focused attention of a man who actually knew what he was looking at, and she stood in the barn doorway watching him, and thinking that there was something deeply satisfying about competence, about watching a person do something they knew how to do as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "It'll fit," he said, after about 2 minutes of examination. "Need to drill 2 new holes, but the plate itself is the right size." "I don't have a drill bit that size," she said. "I brought one." She almost made some remark about his preparedness, but she stopped herself because the remark would have had an edge to it that the situation didn't warrant. He was not showing off. He had simply thought ahead, the way a practical person does, and there was no need to make it complicated. It took him most of the morning. She brought him coffee halfway through, and he thanked her without making a production of it and kept working. She went back to her own work, mending the crack in her boot sole with a piece of leather she had cut from an old harness strap, and she was sitting in the thin autumn sunlight by the fence doing this when she heard him call out that it was done. She walked back to the barn and looked at the plow, and it was whole and solid, and the new moldboard was seated cleanly, and she ran her fingers along the edge of it the way you touch a thing that has been repaired and returned to usefulness. "How much do I owe you?" she asked. "Nothing, Mr. Ralston. The piece was sitting in my barn collecting dust. The time was mine to give if I chose to. You don't owe me anything." She looked at him steadily. "I appreciate what you're doing," she said. "I want you to know I understand what it costs, even if you're saying it doesn't." He met her gaze with that same steadiness she was coming to recognize as fundamental to how he operated in the world. "I know you do," he said. She invited him to stay for the noon meal, which was an offer she could not entirely afford, but that seemed necessary given the circumstances. She had managed to get to Claxton the day before and spend 20 cents of her 43 on dried beans and a small sack of cornmeal. So she had bean soup with cornbread, and it was not elaborate, but it was honest food, cooked properly, and he ate it without any suggestion that it was anything other than exactly right. They talked all through the meal. He told her about growing up in East Texas, on a small cattle operation his father had run with a kind of fierce, stubborn love. He had two younger brothers, both still in Texas. He had come to the territory because the land was open, and the prices were not yet inflated the way they were getting to be further south, and because he wanted something that was his own in a way that his father's operation, even though he had worked it all his life, never quite was. She told him about Missouri, about teaching school in the small town of Alderton for 4 years before she married Roy Sullivan, who had been the older brother of one of her students, and who had come to collect the boy after a fight on the schoolyard one afternoon, and had stayed to argue with her about Tennyson for 2 hours in a way that had impressed her greatly. About the pamphlets Roy had read and the territory he had dreamed about and the way she had married that dream along with the man, so that when the man was gone the dream was still somehow hers. "Do you want to stay?" he asked. "On the claim. Your own choice, setting aside the practical difficulties." She considered the question seriously because it deserved a serious answer. "Yes," she said. "I do. I want to see what I can make of it." He nodded. "Then you will," he said, as though it were simply a matter of decision. She felt the warmth of that certainty in a way that surprised her, because she had not realized how much she had needed to hear someone else say it as though they believed it. He came back the following week with a side of venison from a deer he had taken on the north pasture. He said his smokehouse was full, and he had nowhere to put it, which was possible but also might not have been entirely true. She did not interrogate the logic too carefully. She accepted the meat and said thank you in the way she was learning to say thank you to him, cleanly, without too much ceremony in either direction. He helped her with the water barrel, which had developed a slow leak. He showed her a better way to bank the fire in the stove so it burned more efficiently through the night. He rode by 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes stopping, sometimes just touching his hat from the road, and she found herself listening for the sound of Pearl's hoofbeats in the early morning in a way that she noticed and then set carefully aside, because she was not ready to look at it directly yet. November came in cold and clear. The first hard frost killed the last of the kitchen garden that she had not managed to bring in, but she had laid in enough dried beans and cornmeal and preserved vegetables to last the worst of the winter if she was careful, partly because of her own work, and partly because of the things Ralston had quietly provided that she had accepted and quietly made use of. She had stopped feeling ashamed of the accepting, which was its own kind of progress. One evening in mid-November she was reading by the stove when she heard a knock at the door. It was late, well past dark, and she was surprised enough that she picked up the small iron poker before she went to the door, which she opened carefully. It was Timothy Ralston, and he looked cold and also faintly embarrassed about the cold, which she found charming in a way she was not prepared for. "I'm sorry to come so late," he said. "My horse threw a shoe on the way back from Claxton, and I've been walking the last mile and a half. I saw your light." She opened the door wider. "Come in. I'll put coffee on." He came in and sat at the table, and she put the coffee on and then looked at his coat, which was damp across the shoulders from where he had been out in the light rain that had started an hour ago. She took it from him and hung it near the stove and then sat down across from him, and they looked at each other in the warm lamplight, and the evening felt different from their conversations in the barn or in the yard or at the fence, quieter and more specifically itself, contained by the walls and the darkness outside. "I can put Pearl up in my barn," she said. "She'll need to stay till morning anyway." "That's kind of you." "I'll need you to show me how to take the shoe off the lame foot so she can be comfortable." "I can do that." They went out together in the dark, with the lamp, and he pulled the thrown shoe from Pearl's saddlebag where he had stored it and showed Edna how to remove the remaining nails from the bare hoof carefully. And Pearl stood with the patient dignity of a horse who understood that help was being rendered and was willing to tolerate the process. Edna held the lamp and watched his hands and thought about how he always explained things as though they were simply interesting, without any implication that she ought to already know them or would never be capable of learning them. They went back inside and drank coffee, and then they sat and talked the way people talk when there is no reason to leave and no reason to hurry. He had been to the post office in Claxton that day and had a letter from his younger brother Thomas, who was thinking of coming north to the territory himself. He read her a section of it that described Thomas's plans with a mixture of fond affection and clear-eyed assessment of his brother's tendency to overestimate and underplan, and she laughed again, and again it surprised her, and this time she did not put her hand over her mouth to stop it. "You have a good laugh," he said. "You should use it more." She looked at the table. "I haven't had a great deal to laugh about this year," she said. "No," he said, "I know." There was a quiet between them after that, not uncomfortable but full of things that were not yet words. "Roy," she said, "my husband, he would have liked you." He looked at her carefully. "What was he like?" she told him. Roy Sullivan had been a large, good-humored man with a real gift for enthusiasm and an equal gift for making enthusiasm contagious. He had been a better talker than a planner, but he had known it about himself and had married a woman who was a better planner than a talker, and they had understood each other. He had been kind. He had been funny. He had been gone in an instant, the horse spooked by a rattlesnake on the trail, and she had held his hand while he went, and then she had dug the grave herself because there had been no one else to do it, and then she had gotten in the wagon and driven on because there was nothing behind her and the only direction available was forward. Ralston listened to all of it. When she was done he said, "You're the most capable person I've met in this territory, man or woman." She looked up at him. "That's a broad category. I mean it plainly," he said, "not as a compliment to impress you, as a statement of what I observe." She felt the distinction. She appreciated it. He slept in the barn with Pearl that night, on the pile of straw he had helped her lay in the previous month. She lay in her bed and listened to the rain against the roof and the occasional sound of Pearl shifting in the barn, and she thought about the expression on his face when he talked about his brother Thomas, the warmth in it, and about how a man who could carry that kind of warmth for his family and still be steady and practical and direct was an unusual kind of man. She was not telling herself she was in love with him. She was more careful than that. She was a widow 8 months out from a loss that had rearranged everything in her life, and she understood that loneliness and hunger could make a person attach more meaning to kindness than the kindness itself necessarily contained. She had been hungry. He had brought her food. She had been lonely. He had brought her conversation. These were simple facts, and she intended to hold on to them as facts rather than constructing anything more elaborate out of them until she was more certain of her own ground. But she thought about his hands working the plow in the barn, and she thought about his voice reading his brother's letter, and she thought about the way he had said, "You have a good laugh," and she was honest enough with herself to recognize that something in her had shifted, some internal compass point that was no longer pointing in quite the same direction it had been pointing 2 months ago. In the morning he was up before her, and when she came out of the soddy she found that he had split all the wood she had stacked against the barn wall and restacked it in neat, compact rows against the south wall where it would be out of the wind. He was saddling Pearl when she came out, his breath making small clouds in the cold air. "You didn't have to do that," she said, looking at the wood. "I was awake," he said. Pearl needed another hour before she was ready to travel anyway. She stood in the cold morning looking at the neatly stacked wood and then looked at him. "Timothy," she said, which was the first time she had used his given name. He went still very briefly, just a fraction of a second, in the way that people go still when something matters. "Yes," he said. "Thank you," she said. "Not just for the wood, for all of it." He looked at her across the cold yard, over Pearl's broad back, with those gray eyes that were entirely steady and also somehow not as easy to read as they seemed. "You're welcome," he said. "Edna." He rode away and she stood in the yard for a while after he had gone, listening to the morning. Through November and into December, things changed between them in the slow, deliberate way that things change when two cautious and sensible people are involved. He continued to ride by. She continued to accept his help without apology. She took to saving particular observations, small and specific things that happened during her day, to tell him when he came, and she noticed after a while that she was doing this and that it pleased her in a way she recognized. She was saving things for him. That was a meaningful thing to save. One afternoon she rode into Claxton with him on Pearl, sitting behind him in the saddle because her mule was lame with a stone bruise, and she needed to get to the post office herself. She had written to her sister Clara in Missouri, the first letter in 6 months, and she wanted to send it before the weather closed in. She held Pearl's saddle with one hand and did not hold on to him with the other until they went through a dip in the road and Pearl stumbled slightly, and she grabbed his coat to steady herself. He did not say anything about it, and she did not move her hand from where it had settled against his side. In Claxton, people noticed them arriving together. She was aware of this in the way a woman in a small settlement is always aware of being noticed. Millicent Park, who ran the post office with her husband, looked at Edna with a particular expression when she came through the door, the kind of expression that contained a whole conversational paragraph that would be spoken to her friends later over the counter of the general store. Edna sent her letter and bought a small length of blue ribbon because it cost 2 cents and she wanted it, and she had earned the right to want small things. She came back out to find Ralston at the general store, and she stood beside him while he paid for supplies, and the store owner, a man named Pickard who wore his age like a comfortable old coat, asked after her garden as though it were perfectly ordinary for her to be standing there. Walking back to Pearl, Ralston said quietly, "Does it bother you, the looking?" "The looking was going to happen regardless," she said. "People will make up whatever story suits them." "I've stopped trying to manage other people's stories about me." He considered this. "That's sensible. Also exhausting, but yes, sensible." He looked sideways at her with that contained almost smile. "I'll be more discreet. If it matters. Don't be on my account," she said, and then was slightly alarmed at herself for saying it, because it was the kind of thing you said when you did not mind what people thought you were to each other, and she had not quite examined whether she minded or not. He did not respond to it directly, but he did help her up onto Pearl's back with a hand that held hers a moment longer than pure practicality required, and she noticed, and she thought he noticed that she noticed, and they rode back to her place in a silence that was comfortable and also charged with something she was no longer pretending was simply gratitude. Clara's letter came back 3 weeks later. Clara was worried. Clara thought Edna should come home. Clara thought this whole territory business had been Roy's dream and not Edna's, and that Roy being gone was as good a sign as any that the dream did not fit Edna's life anymore. Clara wrote with love, and also with the particular firmness of a woman who had never left Missouri and did not understand why anyone would want to. Edna read the letter sitting at her table with the lamp lit and the stove going. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in the small box where she kept Roy's deed and her marriage certificate and the single photograph she had of the two of them, taken in Kansas City the year before they headed west. She wrote back to Clara the following morning. She said she was staying. She said the land was hers, legally and by the labor she had put into it. She said she was not unhappy. She said she would explain more in the spring when she had more to explain. She did not mention Timothy Ralston in the letter because she did not yet have language for what he was to her, and she did not want to apply the wrong words and have them harden into a shape that might not be right. Christmas of 1882 came in quietly. There was no church service in Claxton that year because the pastor had gone north to see his family in Kansas and had not yet returned. Edna spent Christmas morning doing the same chores she did every morning, and then in the afternoon she sat by the stove and read. She had 3 books on her shelf, a Bible, a volume of Tennyson that Roy had given her the year they married, and a farming almanac that was 3 years old but still contained useful information. She read Tennyson and felt the familiar mixture of comfort and grief that certain things associated with Roy always brought, the grief less sharp than it had been, worn smooth at the edges, like glass that the water has worked on for a long time. In the late afternoon she heard Pearl's hoofbeats. She went to the door and he was there with a cloth-wrapped parcel tied to his saddle and 2 jars of something that looked like preserves. He looked uncertain in a way she had not seen before, almost careful, which was different from his usual directness. "Merry Christmas," he said. "Merry Christmas," she said, and opened the door all the way. He came in and put the parcel on the table and she unwrapped it. Inside was a length of flannel in a deep red color, enough to make a warm underskirt for winter, and a small jar of vanilla extract, which was a luxury she had not had since Missouri. She looked at these things for a long moment. "How did you know about the vanilla?" she asked. "You mentioned once that you used to make vanilla biscuits on Christmas morning when you were a child," he said. "Back in Missouri." She had mentioned that, once, in passing weeks ago. He had been listening in a way that noticed and kept the small things. She looked up at him. He was watching her with that steady, open expression and also something else beneath it. Something she recognized because it was the same thing she had been carrying around herself for weeks, carefully and quietly, not quite ready to set it down in front of anyone, including herself. "Timothy," she said. "Yes," he said. "I think you know," she said, "that this has become something more than neighboring." He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, I know. I'm not sure what to do about it," she said honestly. "I'm 8 months out from losing Roy, and I'm still on uncertain ground in this territory, and I'm a practical woman who is trying very hard not to make decisions based on gratitude or loneliness." "Those are good reasons to be careful," he said. "They are," she agreed. He sat down at the table, which she took as his way of saying that this was a conversation he was willing to have properly. She sat across from him. "I'll tell you what I know," he said. "I rode past your fence 2 months ago and saw a woman working alone in cold ground with her bare hands, and I thought, that person has more will in her than most people I've met in my life. And then I thought about it for 3 days before I did anything about it, because I'm a careful man, and I know the difference between admiration and what comes after it. And what I've had for you, Edna, for some time now, is what comes after it." She looked at her hands on the table. She looked at his hands on the table, large and capable and still. She thought about the plate on the fence, the steam rising from it in the cold air, and how it had felt to be fed by someone who had seen her need and met it without making her ask. "I'm not ready," she said. "Not yet, but I want you to know I'm not saying no. I'm saying give me time." "I have time," he said simply. "I'm not going anywhere." They made coffee together, side by side at the stove, which felt domestic and also lovely, and they drank it slowly while the afternoon went blue and gold outside the window, and she felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the stove. The winter of 1882 and into 1883 was hard, but she was less alone in it. Ralston was a consistent presence, not intrusive, not performing concern, just there in the practical, solid way he was there for everything. When a late blizzard blew in February and she lost 2 of her chickens to the cold, he helped her build a better shelter for the remaining ones, using scrap lumber from his barn. When her mule's stone bruise healed and she needed help learning to use the repaired plow in the early spring thaw, he walked the field with her, patient and informative. And something else was happening through those months, below the practical surface of things, something that grew the way things grow in winter, underground, unhurried, gathering toward itself without making any noise about it. She found herself looking forward to his visits the way she had not looked forward to anything since before Roy died. She found herself saving not just observations but questions, things she wanted to know about him, things about Texas and his brothers, and what he had thought about when he decided to come north to the territory. She found herself reading a passage from Tennyson sometimes, and wishing he were there to argue about it the way Roy had argued about it, and then realizing that she wanted Timothy Ralston there for his own specific reasons and not as a stand-in for anyone else. That was important. That meant something real. She told him this one day in early March, standing in the barn while she showed him how she planned to reorganize the vegetable plot now that she had a better sense of the soil. She had been talking about companion planting, about putting beans next to corn the way the people of this land had always done, and somehow she ended up saying what she had been thinking. "I want to tell you something," she said. He looked up from the diagram she had drawn in the dirt with a stick. "When I thought about it in January, February, whether what I feel for you is gratitude or something else, I was afraid I would not be able to tell them apart. But I can tell them apart now. They're different things. The gratitude is real and I have it. The other thing is also real and I have that too, and they're not the same thing and they don't blur into each other." He looked at her for a long moment. The March light was thin and bright through the barn door, and it caught the gray in his eyes and made them look almost silver. "Edna," he said, and her name in his voice was a different sound than she had heard it make before, lower and more certain. "Are you telling me you've made up your mind?" "I'm telling you I know my own mind," she said, "which is the thing I needed to know before I could tell you anything else." He crossed the barn in 3 steps, which were not very many steps given how wide the barn was, but they were very deliberate steps, and then he took her face in both his hands, which smelled of sawdust and hay and the cold outside, and he kissed her the way a man kisses a woman when he has been waiting a long time and intends to make it clear that the waiting was worth it. She put her hands flat against his chest and felt his heart under her palms, steady and fast at the same time, which told her everything she needed to know about how long he had been keeping this particular thing quiet and careful inside him. They stood in the barn doorway in the March light for a while after that, not kissing anymore, just standing close, and she thought about the plate on the fence and the steam rising from it in October cold, and she thought, this is where that started, all of it, this whole improbable, essential thing. Spring came to the Oklahoma territory with a generosity it had withheld the previous year. The rains came right, not too much and not too little, and her garden went in deep and green, and the corn came up thick, and the hens started laying again with a reliability that bordered on the apologetic, as though they knew they had let her down and were making it up to her. Timothy Ralston asked her to marry him on the 1st of April, 1883, which she found quietly hilarious given the date, but he was completely serious, and she was serious when she said yes. The proposal happened at the fence, the same north fence she had been working on that first October morning when he had stopped his horse and told her about the post driver. He had brought a picnic of sorts, bread and cheese and some early radishes from his kitchen garden, and they had sat on the blanket he brought and eaten it in the warm spring sunlight and talked for a long time about practical things, as they usually did, the spring planting and whether his younger brother Thomas was genuinely coming north or just talking about it. And then he had put down his bread and looked at her with complete directness and said, "Edna Sullivan, I want to marry you, if you'll have me." "I will," she said, without hesitating, because she had been thinking about it for long enough that the hesitation had all been used up already. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring, a simple gold band with a small garnet set in it that caught the sunlight and went red as an ember. He had bought it in Guthrie on his last trip north, he told her, which meant he had been planning this for at least a month. "You were that certain," she said, looking at the ring on her finger. "I was that hopeful," he corrected. "There's a difference." They were married in the Claxton church on a Saturday in May 1883, which had gotten its proper roof the previous year, and could therefore accommodate a wedding without worrying about the weather. It was not a large ceremony. Ralston's younger brother Thomas had arrived in the territory 2 weeks earlier, slightly more organized than Ralston had predicted and considerably more charming, and he stood up with his brother. Edna's neighbor woman, Martha Hale, who had the claim to the east, stood with Edna. Millicent Park from the post office cried, which surprised Edna, and then she realized that Millicent had been keeping track of this particular story all along and felt some personal investment in it. The pastor said the words, and they said the words back to him, and then they were married, which was a fact that felt both large and very simple at the same time. They stayed that first night at Edna Sullivan because she wanted to, because it was hers and she was not yet ready to leave it, even for the larger and more comfortable house on the Ralston property. They sat outside on the bench he had helped her make the previous fall and watched the stars come out over the territory in the slow, lavish way the stars came out when the air was clear, which it was that May night, perfectly clear and still. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking about your mother's curtains," she said. He looked at her with gentle puzzlement. "The curtains at your house," she said. "They were Ben Hargrove's wife's curtains, you told me. But I've been thinking that a woman who moves into a house ought to have curtains she chose herself, not to remove anything, just to add what's hers." He looked out at the stars. "Is that a way of telling me you're going to redecorate?" "It's a way of telling you I'm thinking about making it a home," she said. He reached out and took her hand where it lay on the bench between them, and held it, and they sat like that for a long time while the stars settled into their places, and the coyotes started up their distant conversation out in the dark, and the prairie made its nighttime sounds around them. She moved to the Ralston property in June, keeping her own claim active because she still had 2 years left on the 5-year homestead requirement, and Ralston rode over regularly to do the maintenance work that proved occupation. It was a legal arrangement that made practical sense and also gave her a particular satisfaction, because it was her land and she was keeping it. Her new home on the Hargrove-Ralston spread came to life the way homes do when someone moves in who knows how to make a space into something more than its dimensions. She put up the curtains she chose herself, a blue gingham she had ordered from Guthrie, practical and cheerful. She reorganized the kitchen with the efficient logic of a woman who cooked serious food and knew where things ought to be. She brought her books from the Sadi and added them to Ralston's shelf, and his collection and hers together made something that pleased both of them when they looked at it. She discovered that he read at night, something she had not known, that he had a habit of sitting up by the lamp for an hour after she went to bed, working through whatever book was current on the shelf, and she started staying up with him, each of them reading their own book in companionable quiet, and this became one of her favorite things, the lamp between them, the house quiet, the pages turning. Thomas Ralston, who had set up on a claim about 7 miles north, came to supper on Sundays when the weather allowed, and he turned out to be excellent company. He was 26, lean and quick laughing, with his brother's directness but more of it spent on humor than on steadiness. He and Edna took to each other with the easy warmth of people who recognize that they share the most important sensibility, which was a comprehensive devotion to the person they each loved most. "He talked about you before I came up here," Thomas told her one Sunday evening, the three of them at the table after supper. "In his letters. Didn't use your name for about 3 letters, just called you the neighbor. Then started putting your name in everything." "I was not subtle," Ralston confirmed without apparent embarrassment. "You were not subtle," Edna said. "You were not noticing," he returned. "I was noticing," she said. "I was being careful." He looked at her across the table, and the warmth between them was a visible thing, warm enough that Thomas picked up his coffee cup and looked tactfully out the window for a moment. By late summer she knew she was carrying a child. She told him on a Tuesday morning when the light was coming in clear and gold through the blue curtains, while they were at the breakfast table and the coffee was still hot. She told him simply, the way she told him everything, and his face went through something she had never seen on it before, not the steadiness and not the warmth and not the humor, but something beyond all of those, a depth of feeling so genuine that it made her eyes fill before she had time to decide whether she felt like crying. He reached across the table and took both her hands in his. He did not say anything for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful with itself. Are you frightened?" He asked, "Be honest." "A little," she said. "The practical parts, we're far from a doctor." "Martha Hale's mother was a midwife," he said. "I'll ride over this week." "You already thought about this," she said. "I thought about everything," he said. "I'm a careful man, remember." She laughed. He smiled. Outside the window, the September territory was all gold and blue and endless. The pregnancy was, on the whole, manageable. She was not a woman who let her body's changes slow her down more than necessary. And the morning illness in the first months was unpleasant but brief. And after it passed, she felt a vigor she had not had since before Roy died, as though her body had found some additional resource to draw on. She kept working the kitchen garden through the fall, lighter work as her size increased, and she kept the books and the correspondence for the ranch operation, which Ralston had been doing himself and was relieved to hand over. She found she had a talent for the accounting side of things that she had not previously known she possessed. The numbers were like a language she had been waiting to learn, orderly and honest, and she organized his records with a thoroughness that impressed even Thomas, who came to help with the books one week and spent most of the time watching her work and making admiring remarks that Ralston bore with tolerant patience. "She's good at everything," Thomas said to his brother, not quite under his breath. "I know," Ralston said. "It's a little frightening," Thomas said. "You get used to it," Ralston said, and looked at her with a pride that was not performative, just there, as simply and permanently present as the land. Her son was born on the 14th of March, 1884. Martha Hale's mother, who was a stout and capable woman named Agnes who had delivered approximately 40 babies in her lifetime, drove over in her cart on a frozen morning when the sky was the kind of white that meant more snow was coming. And she arrived in time, and the labor was long but not dangerous. And at the end of it, there was a boy with a considerable amount of dark hair and a pair of lungs that established immediately that he had no intention of being overlooked. Timothy Ralston held his son for the first time standing by the window in the blue-curtained room, the snow coming down outside in the kind of thick, peaceful way that winter sometimes managed, and his face was the face she had seen at the breakfast table when she told him, that depth of feeling and also something new in it, something that looked like a man understanding for the first time what his life was actually for. "James Roy Ralston," she said, "if you agree." He looked at her over the baby's head. Roy's name carried forward. She had thought about it carefully. Roy had brought her to this territory, this land, this life, and it seemed right that his name should live in the life that had grown from the one he had started. "James Roy Ralston," he said. "Yes." She was asleep before he had finished speaking, which was forgivable given the circumstances. The years settled into themselves with the reliable rhythm of hard-worked good land. James Roy Ralston grew from the substantial, energetic infant he had been into a substantial, energetic toddler with his father's steadiness, and his mother's sharp eyes, and a personality that combined both into something entirely his own. He was the kind of child who sat very quietly and watched things for a long time before engaging with them, which was Roy's method, and then engaged with them with a thoroughness that was entirely his mother. Edna proved up her homestead claim in 1885, officially having met all the requirements of the Homestead Act, and the day the final papers came through Claxton she and Ralston rode out to her soddy, which they had kept up in good repair through those years, and stood in front of it in the spring afternoon and looked at it. "We could expand," he said. "Connect the two properties properly. More water access with your creek." "Yes," she said, "we could." She looked at the fence she had built, post by post, the fence where a plate of food had sat on a cold October morning and changed everything. Some of those original posts were still there. The others had been replaced as needed, but the ones from that first season were solid, weathered to a dark gray that was almost the color of his eyes. "I want to keep the fence," she said. He looked at her and then looked at the fence. "We'll work around it," he said. The expansion of the property took most of that summer and into the fall, with Thomas helping and 2 hired hands they brought on for the season. The properties merged by law and by labor, and the result was a working cattle operation of real substance, 112 acres under cultivation, and the rest as grazing land, with the creek providing reliable water through even dry summers, and the combined knowledge of Edna's gardening and farming instincts and Ralston's cattle expertise making the whole thing work with the kind of efficiency that came from genuine partnership. She began teaching again that fall, informally at first. There was a homesteading family, the Garner family, who had come to the territory that spring with 5 children, the oldest of whom was 12, and had not been inside a schoolroom in 2 years. Edna started teaching him at her kitchen table on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and within a month she had 3 more students, and within 6 months the settlement had produced enough children in need of schooling that a proper arrangement seemed necessary. She wrote to the territorial authorities. She was persistent, which was not a new quality in her. By the spring of 1886, Claxton had a 1-room schoolhouse, properly established, with Edna Ralston as its teacher, and she rode the 3.5 miles there and back 4 days a week on a bay gelding named Patterson that had a cooperative temperament and an excellent trot. The schoolhouse was a point of some pride in the settlement, and also a point of some controversy, because there were those who thought the territory's resources were better spent on other things, and those who thought education was the spine of any civilized future. And the two sides had the kind of argument that small settlements have about everything important, which is to say loudly and repeatedly until reality settled it. Reality settled it in the form of the 16 children who filled the schoolhouse by the end of 1886, and whose parents, even the most skeptical among them, could not argue with the visible improvement in their children's ability to read, write, add, and reason about the world. Timothy Ralston came to the schoolhouse once, in October of 1886, to fix a window frame that had come loose in a storm. He arrived in the middle of the school day, and she watched him work on the window from the corner of her eye while she kept the lesson going, and he was quiet and careful and did not disrupt anything, which was very like him. When he was done, he looked at the room full of children and then looked at her at the front of the room, and she saw something cross his face that she recognized as the same look he had when he watched James Roy learning to walk, that same depth. She met him at the door afterward, the children released for their noon break and spilling out into the fall sunshine. "What were you thinking?" she asked. "Just now, that look." "I was thinking," he said, "that I rode past a fence in October of 1882 and thought, that woman has more will than anyone I've ever seen, and I was right, but I did not know the half of it." She took his face in both her hands, which was not something she did often in public, because she had been raised in Missouri where public displays of affection were considered slightly alarming. But the schoolhouse door was around the corner from the main road, and no one was looking, and she kissed him the way she had learned to kiss him over 3 years of marriage, which was thoroughly and without apology. He held her against him in the fall light, and she felt his arms around her and the warmth of him in the October cold, and thought about how the same October cold, 4 years ago, had held nothing for her but difficulty and hunger and the vast indifference of the land. She had a different October now, the same land but different in every way that mattered. Their daughter, Margaret Clara Ralston, was born in January of 1887, named partly for Roy's mother and partly for Edna's sister in Missouri, who had by now reconciled herself to the fact that Edna was not coming back to Missouri, and had instead begun writing letters that were considerably warmer than her earlier ones, full of interest in James Roy and the schoolhouse and the cattle operation and the territory in general. And Edna suspected that Clara was romanticizing the West from a distance of several hundred miles, but she let her, because it made for better letters. Margaret was nothing like her brother in temperament. Where James Roy was quiet and watchful, Margaret was loud and immediate, with strong opinions about everything from the age of about 18 months Opinions she delivered in a combination of words and pointed gestures that made her father laugh every single time regardless of how often she deployed them. She had Edna's coloring, dark hair and hazel eyes, and Ralston's chin, firm and decided, and she was going to be a formidable person, and everyone who knew her understood this early. Thomas Ralston, meanwhile, had proven that he was slightly better at planning than his brother had given him credit for, and his claim to the North was developing into a respectable operation. In 1886, he had married a woman named Florence Bright, who had come to the territory to keep house for her brother and had stayed because she liked it. And Florence and Edna became firm friends within a month of meeting, which delighted Thomas and also mildly surprised him, because Florence was reserved and particular, and not everyone came through her filters with the speed that Edna did. "You cleared her completely in about 20 minutes, Thomas told Edna once. "I've never seen her do that with anyone. She's sensible," Edna said. "It was easy to see that straight away." The two families ate supper together on Sundays when the weather allowed, which it usually did through spring and summer and fall, and the table on those evenings was full and loud and argued about everything and agreed about most of the important things. And James Roy thought his Uncle Thomas was the funniest person in the world, and Margaret thought Florence's braids were the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, and wanted her own braids done the same way every single Sunday without exception. In the spring of 1888, a dry spring that brought the first whispers of another drought, there was trouble on the western edge of the territory that touched them indirectly but significantly. There had been increasing pressure on the land, new settlers coming in faster than the infrastructure could support, and the laws governing land rights were being enforced unevenly, with the people who had been on the land the longest and had the fewest legal resources finding themselves crowded by those who were newer and better connected. Ralston had always been decent in his dealings with the families around him, and this was known, and it meant that when a dispute arose between two neighboring homesteaders about a water source that sat on the boundary of both claims, they came to him to help work it out rather than to the county office in Guthrie, where such things had a tendency to get expensive and complicated. He spent 3 days riding back and forth between the two parties, patient and logical, and in the end, both families got reliable access to the water source through a shared arrangement that Edna helped him write up in language precise enough to be legally meaningful. She thought about the Homestead Act and what it had promised, and what the territory had actually delivered, and the difference between the two, which was considerable. The act had promised 160 acres and opportunity, and it had delivered those things, but opportunity in the territory was not equally distributed, and she knew, teaching in her schoolhouse, that some of the children in her class came from families who were hanging on by the thinnest of threads, families where the drought or the bad market or the simple bad luck of a broken tool at the wrong moment had not been met with a neighbor who came by with a plate of food and a practical solution. She talked to him about this at night. Their reading hour turned into a talking hour, as it sometimes did when something important was working through her mind. "There are people here who don't have what we have," she said, "and I don't mean the property. I mean the fact of another person who sees what you need and does something about it." "I know," he said. "I want to do something about it," she said. "Through the school, maybe, or some other way, a way that doesn't humiliate anyone. Because the thing that helps is not the food on the plate, it's the fact that someone brought it without making you ask." He looked at her from across the table, those gray eyes, that steadiness. "You've thought about this for a while," he said. "Since October of 1882, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you want to do?" She had been thinking about it, and what she had been thinking was this: a kind of quiet community practice, not organized with paperwork and committees, but understood, a practice of neighbors looking in on neighbors in the specific, practical way that Ralston had looked in on her. Not charity in the way that humiliated, but mutual aid in the way that simply acknowledged that the territory was hard, and everyone in it had bad seasons, And there was no weakness in having a bad season if the people around you behaved as though having a bad season was simply a thing that happened to people. She started it through the schoolhouse, which was already a hub of the community. She simply began knowing things, which was easy because she was a teacher and the children told her everything. And when she knew that a family was in a difficult stretch, she and Timothy would appear with practical help that was offered as though it were entirely ordinary. A side of beef. A morning of fencing work. Seeds for the spring garden. It was always given without ceremony and accepted with whatever grace the recipient could manage, and it was never spoken of in a way that created debt or shame. Word got around, the way things did in small settlements, and others began to participate. And within a year it was simply a thing that the community around Claxton did. This watching out for each other in the specific and practical way. And Edna Ralston was at the center of it, not as an authority, but as the person who had started it, by understanding what it felt like to need it. James Roy was 5 years old in the spring of 1889, old enough to follow his father around the property with the focused attention he brought to everything, and to ask questions that were sometimes unanswerable in a way that was also entirely characteristic of him. Why does water run downhill? Why does the sky look different before a storm than after it? Why do cattle bunch together when they are frightened? Ralston answered every question as completely as he could, and when he could not he said so, which James Roy accepted as a satisfactory answer because it was at least honest. Edna watched her husband with their son and felt the particular fullness of that, the rightness of a good man teaching a small person how to be in the world. It was different from what she had expected when she imagined, back in Missouri, what a family might look like. It was more grounded than she had imagined, more ordinary in the best sense of that word, more of the particular texture of daily life, and less of the romantic abstraction she had read about in books. She was not less happy for its being ordinary. She was more happy because ordinary things that were genuinely good were the best kind of good. They stayed. In the fall of 1889, she stood at the north fence of her original homestead claim, the fence she had asked him to keep when they merged the properties, and she put her hands on the rail and looked at the post where the plate had sat. The post was one of the original ones, weathered and dark, solid in the ground after 7 years. The frost was on the grass around it, and the air had the same cold clarity it had had that October morning, and the sky was the same thin blue. She heard his boots on the frozen ground behind her. He came and stood beside her, close enough that his shoulder was against hers, and he followed her gaze to the post. 7 years, she said. 7 years, he agreed. When you put that plate there, she said, what were you thinking, honestly? He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was being genuinely honest with himself rather than reaching for the easy answer. I was thinking that you were going to be all right, he said. Eventually, whether I did anything or not, but that I could help it be sooner rather than later, and that there was no good reason not to. She turned to look at him. The October light was doing something to his face, the same light that had been doing something to his face the first time she had looked at it properly, making the gray of his eyes almost silver. And the rest of it, she said. Everything after the plate. The rest of it, he said, was entirely your doing. You made yourself impossible to stop thinking about. I was trying to fix a fence post, she said. You were trying to fix a fence post with your bare hands in frozen ground, he said, because you were not going to let the land beat you. That was the thing. That was all of it. She leaned her head against his shoulder there at the fence, with the frost-edged territory spreading out around them in every direction and the cattle visible in the far pasture, and the sound of their children's voices coming from the direction of the house, James Roy calling something to Margaret and Margaret calling something back at a higher volume and with more insistence. She's going to be a handful, she said. She already is, he said. She'll be fine. Margaret was going to be fine. James Roy was going to be fine. The land was going to be fine. The school in Claxton was going to be fine. Thomas and Florence, up the road to the north, We're going to be fine. And Florence was expecting their first child in February. And Edna had already offered to help with the birth and had already talked to Agnes about availability. Everything was going to be fine. She believed this in the specific, tested way that a person believes things after they have been tested, not with the naive optimism of someone who has not yet met difficulty, but with the clear-eyed confidence of someone who has met difficulty on its own terms and learned what it was made of. She straightened up from his shoulder and looked at the post one more time, that original fence post, dark and weathered and solid in the ground. She thought about a plate of food in October cold, steam rising from it in the clear air, the simple and unasked-for act of one person seeing another person's need and meeting it. That was where love started. Not always with ceremony, not always with language. Sometimes with a plate of scrambled eggs and bacon on a fence rail, set there by a careful man who was not going to make her ask. She took his hand and they walked back toward the house, toward the sound of their children's voices, toward the warmth and the good ordinary life they had built on this land that the territory had offered and they had earned, together, and separately and together again. Through 7 years of seasons that had been hard and soft and cold and bright and full of everything that mattered. James Roy was at the gate when they reached it, his father's serious face and his mother's sharp eyes, 7 years old and wanting to know if they could put up the new water trough today because he had been waiting 3 days and 3 days was a very long time. Yes, his father said. Yes, his mother said. Now, said James Roy. Timothy Ralston looked at Edna Ralston over their son's head, and she looked back at him, and the whole of it passed between them in a moment. The fence post and the plate, the cold October and the March barn, the Christmas ribbon and the garnet ring, the first years of careful distance and the 7 years of chosen closeness, the children and the schoolhouse and the fence and the land, and all the seasons laid end to end like the territory itself, enormous and particular and entirely theirs. Now, Ralston said, and James Roy shot through the gate toward the barn, and Margaret came running from the house with her braids flying and her considerable opinions already in progress, and Edna Sullivan Ralston of the Oklahoma Territory, who had not eaten a full meal in 3 days the first time the man beside her left a plate on her fence, laughed in the October light and held her husband's hand and walked home.